It doesn't matter who's president. The government is always going to do a degree of spin to help people or to try to get people to not panic. I think to the degree that the governments of the world understand the problem is in some question in my mind. But the biggest concern that I have is we are radically unprepared for China exiting the manufacturing business. Demographically speaking, their labor costs have gone up now by a factor of 16 since 2020. They're no longer the low-cost producer of anything. And the demographic situation is now so atrocious that they're literally running out of people aged 40 to be in the factories in the first place. And that's before you consider perhaps an energy shock because of the Ukraine war or trade shock because of tensions with the United States. We're going to lose them. And we are not ready for that. Well, central bank digital currencies mean something different to everyone. And in the most extreme version, which is what the Chinese are trying to implement, there's some version of what you just outlined actually is the express government goal, the ability to monitor in real time every transaction everywhere. But keep in mind the very big difference between the American system and the Chinese system. The American Federal Reserve is just a few hundred people, and they have no interest in monitoring transactions, and they have no capacity without at least 100-fold expansion in their staff. China has 1.3 billion people, and government control of everyone's daily life is the first and foremost goal of the Chinese Communist Party. So for one of these governments, a digital currency is expressly designed to do exactly what you said. And in the other case, with the Federal Reserve isn't even sure it wants one. The Federal Reserve is poking at it, but it doesn't at the moment see a very strong use case for an independent digital currency. Now, if you talk about a digital currency as what the Fed is actually doing, which is just basically making all transactions that want to be digital, and you use paper to cash as rarely as possible, and everything is cleared on your phone, then yes, the Federal Reserve is going that direction. But the United Kingdom is already there because the United Kingdom basically got rid of paper checks. So there's a natural evolution here in the financial system that the Fed is embracing. But what most people talk about when they're talking about CDBs is really not what the Western world is even exploring, much less has an interest in. This is weird. So I'm not a big fan of the Biden administration's economic policies writ large, but this is one where I think at least they've got the spirit right, even if they've got some of the details wrong. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is a dumb name for what it actually does, seeks to build out processing capacity for a lot of the technologies and especially a lot of the base materials that are required in order to do the green transition. Now, I'm a green, but I'm a green that tends to get uninvited to parties because I can actually do math. And I call people when they're saying bullshit. In the case of what's going on with the Biden administration, though, we are the sunniest first world country after Australia, and we are the windiest first world country. So there is a lot of room in the United States in an economically viable manner to expand our green tech footprint and splice it in with everything else we do. Now, there's 1,000 caveats in that statement about the wheres and the whens and the hows and the how fasts. But I think that's a good starting point. The weak point in the American green tech industry is we produce almost none of the base materials and even less of the processed materials. So once the lithium is basically mined and concentrated, it then needs to be turned into lithium metal. That processing step from the powder to the metal, none of that's done here. Very little of the copper harnesses are done. Almost no of the nickel processing is done here, and on and on and on and on. And if I'm right about China, we're going to lose the location that does most of the processing. And guess what the country is in the world that does the second most processing? Russia. So the idea that there's a few $100 billion floating around in the American system to chase after industry to do this at scale in North America, I think is a grand idea. Once you get out of the weeds, you will find things you don't like. But overall, remember, this is the first industrial policy the United States has had since the 1940s. The advantage we have on the American president right now is that he was a full grown-ass man in the 1940s. He remembers how that went. He's the only person alive right now who does. And so it makes sense that he's the first person to come up with an industrial policy since then. Well, let me give you four. The first one, and by far the most significant, is the demographic collapse. As countries industrialize, they move into the cities and birth rate drops. And the same time that happened in China, starting in the late 1970s, the Chinese also instituted the one-child policy. So you had economic trends crashing the birth rate at the same time as the government forced it down even further. And now in major cities across China, the number of births per woman is below 0.8, which is a historical low for any country in any era. And we're looking at a complete loss of the working class in China in under a decade. And there's not an economic model that works with that at all. So that's number one. There's no negotiating on that one. You can't fix that. Second big problem is that Chairman Xi has executed or exiled or imprisoned everyone within the PRC who's capable of independent thought, and no one wants to bring him information anymore. So if you were going to attempt to have a more dynamic system that thinks forward, thinks ahead, they don't have that anymore. They may have had it at one point, we can debate that, but it's gone now. And you basically have one guy making policy in a box and everyone afraid to tell him anything because they don't want to be the next messenger that's shot. That's not a great thing to do when your country is facing critical problems. Number three, the financial sector. When the United States got into trouble in 2008 with subprime, we had doubled total private credit in 8 years. That was too much too fast. China has increased their credit by a factor of 34 in 20 years. There is no country in history that has gone up this far, this fast, ever, and survived doing 1/3 of that volume. So you want to talk about a financial crisis, it will be centered in the People's Republic, and the economic sector that is most exposed in China is agriculture. So not only do you have an industrial bust to go with the financial bust, you might even have famine. And that brings us to the fourth thing. China imports 3/4 of their energy. 3/4 of that comes from the Persian Gulf or further beyond. And they import over 3/4 of the inputs that are required for them to grow their own food. They are the country most dependent upon international trade simply to exist. And whether it's the Ukraine war or spat in the Persian Gulf or the Americans going on the warpath or simply internal political incompetence, which is now rising every day, this doesn't work, not in a non-globalized system. So China is going to flame out just as impressively as it flamed on. And we're all going to remember it for a good long time. Is that most Russian crude, about 70%, is produced in the permafrost. And because the Russian demographic is terminal, and because the Russian educational system collapsed 30 years ago, there's only a very small cadre of skilled workers that are actually trained up to do the work in the permafrost. And they're on average in their late 50s now. So there's not a lot of them. They're literally dying out. And without Western tech and above all else, Western workers, the ability of the Russians to keep this stuff flowing is very much called into question. And that's before you consider war, sanctions, or boycotts, all of which are having their own impact. So we need to plan for a not too distant future when Russian crude exports just aren't there. Now, in that scenario, especially if it happens suddenly, we're going to have a significant price shock around the world. And then you have to look to Washington. Because in Washington, the American president has the authority to end oil exports with the stroke of a pen. It doesn't have to go to Congress. That authority was already granted back in 2015. And since Biden is the most economically populist president we've ever had, there is no way he is going to expose the American consumer, the American voter, to high and volatile global prices if he doesn't have to. So the question just isn't when will the Russian stuff go offline? It's how much American stuff goes on offline with it. And if the world loses American and Russian crude at the same time, you're probably looking at crude prices never dropping below 150 again. And you're probably looking at a captured price in North America where they never rise above 70 again. Probably. There's a lot of ifs and statements linked to that prediction. Well, any sector you're going to be able to find companies that are in problems. The one I am by far the most concerned about on a global basis is America's Apple. Starting with what's going on in the tech sector, the pace of technological advance is going to slow considerably. And if Apple can no longer release a new version every 6 months, that's obviously going to hit their bottom line. But more importantly, roughly 90% of the supply chain steps that go into the average iPhone touch the People's Republic of China in some way. Now, a lot of that is going to be more in the low value add and assembly, but that's not nothing either. And without the Chinese as part of the supply system, it's going to take Apple at least 5 years to rebuild that supply chain capacity in other parts of the world.